systems. As all of you know, BAE is one of New Hampshire's largest employers and is a longtime member of the New England Council. We are grateful for their support for this morning's breakfast, but more importantly, their ongoing engagement to the New England Council. And Tom Bishop would be here ordinarily. He's a little under the weather, and he sends his best, but he truly has been a great ambassador for BAE. As 23 draws to a close, we have a few more final events this year that I wanted to remind you of. If anyone came to our annual dinner in Boston this past month, our chairman indicated in his remarks that between the first quarter of 22 to the present, New England Council's had 100 in-person events all over New England and in Washington, and we have not taken our foot off the gas at all. In fact, we have two more Capitol Hill events in Boston this month with the former chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Richie Neal, on the 11th, and Representative Jim McGovern, the former chair of the Rules Committee, on the 15th. One of our more popular events of the year is our annual holiday reception, which will take place on the evening of December 13th at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library. We'll wrap up the year, December 18th, with a very special program looking at the affordable housing crisis here in New England. Senator Elizabeth Warren will deliver keynote remarks, followed by a panel discussion with New England Council members who are engaged in the effort to address this crisis. As always, you can find more information and register for any of these programs on our website, newenglandcouncil.com. Today we're thrilled to welcome back the senior senator for this great state of New Hampshire. And needless to say, a great friend to the New England Council, and I'm sure to just about everyone in this room, Senator Jeanne Shaheen. Now in a third term in Capitol Hill, the senator has a well-earned reputation as someone who's willing to work across the aisle to advance policies that promote economic growth and the quality of life here in New England, and I might say across the country. I think we all agree that something like that we need more now than ever. Throughout her time in the United States Senate, she's been a champion for the small businesses, an advocate for our nation's armed forces and defense sector, and she has fought tirelessly to combat and prevent substance use disorder here in the Granite State and beyond. Needless to say, we're honored that she could join us this morning amidst the year-end spirit to wrap up a key legislation on several critical issues facing our nation. Please join me in welcoming our guest, the Honorable United States Senator Jeanne Shaheen.
Thank you very much, Jim. There's a lot of water up here. Is all this for me? Well, good morning. Thank you to the New England Council, to Jim and Larry and everybody there for hosting me, and to all of you for coming out early this morning. I know some of you have traveled a ways, so I really appreciate that, that you're here to, you know, it wouldn't be the end of the year if I didn't get to come to the New England Council and meet with all of you and talk about what's happening in Washington. So, as I was making my notes, I thought, well, I need to be really brief because we want to have a lot of time for questions, but of course then my notes kept going on and on and on. So I will try and be briefer than my notes are. You all saw, I'm sure, this week the new economic numbers that show that we grew at 5.2% in the third quarter. And yet people are still not feeling relief despite that economic growth. And while gas prices are down, food prices are still too high, mortgage rates are high, and for lots of folks, particularly young people who are just getting out of college, because the student loan proposal that President Biden had to help with student loan costs got knocked down in the courts. We have a lot of young people who are feeling like they can't start their lives, start their families, buy houses because of what they're facing in terms of payments. So as I've traveled around New Hampshire in the last, really since the pandemic, but particularly in this year, what I hear from businesses are three big concerns: housing, childcare, and workforce. So housing in New Hampshire, our rental vacancy rate is 0.6%. I know all of you know that because you're hearing that from folks. That's the fourth lowest in the country. I had a chance to meet with the head of the Boston Fed this summer, whose name, by the way, is Susan Collins. She said she doesn't often get confused, however, because she's from the Caribbean. But she said, as she traveled around the New England states, New Hampshire has the tightest housing market of any state in the country. Our costs are higher and our inventory is lowest. So that is a real challenge as we think about how we continue to grow the economy. And as I talked, I was meeting with a group of realtors and housing experts a couple of months ago, and I was asking them why New Hampshire is having this challenge. And there were two theories. The head of the realtor said, well, it's because New Hampshire is such a great place to live. And he proceeded to tell me how most of his sales had been from people from out of state rather than from New Hampshire folks coming in. But the housing experts said there are a couple of reasons, one of which is the restrictive zoning that we have that makes it hard for people to build. So thinking about how we address those is going to be important. And one of the things that has happened at the federal level is there is some funding for technical assistance for communities that want to look at this issue and see how to better address restrictive zoning to make more housing available. And of course, we need to continue the low-income housing tax credit so that we can encourage developers to come in and build the housing that we need for employees. The second issue, big issue I've heard from people is childcare. And for any of us who have, I was just saying my youngest grandchild is now in high school, so it's become less of an issue for my children. But for those people who have kids, you know that this is a huge challenge. Costs are high for most families in New England. After housing, that's the second highest cost families have. And in New Hampshire, since 2019, we've lost 1,500 childcare slots. And we've only got about half of the openings that we need for kids 6 and under. So half. So you can imagine the challenge for working families. And of course, without childcare, people can't join the workforce, women can't work. And so that's a huge issue. Workforce, both housing and childcare contribute to the workforce challenge that we've got. I haven't been in a business in the last 3 years that hasn't told me we can't get the workers that we need. And I think it's not just about housing and childcare and some of the other challenges that you're facing as employers, but it's also about the fact that we don't have enough people. I was at the Kennedy School in the early 2000s after I left the governor's office, and I remember the dean of the Kennedy School was a workforce expert, and I remember his showing these charts of what the workforce was going to look like when we got to the late teens and early 20s in this country. And he said we're going to be relying on two things: older workers and immigrants. And we have had the tightest, most restrictive immigration policies for legal immigration in the last 6 years that we've had in my lifetime. So the people that we need to do the jobs are not here. We need comprehensive immigration reform to deal with that. We need H-2B visas to be increased so that those seasonal workers can be here. We need to get that done. Now, since the pandemic, the federal delegation has delivered about $17 billion, with a B, in federal funding to the state of New Hampshire. That's just for COVID relief programs. So in addition to that, we've passed the infrastructure legislation, which I talked about last year, so I'm not going to go into at great detail. But as you know, that provides for funding for roads and bridges and water systems and sewer systems. But it also provides funding for things like the $44 million that the Advanced Regenerative Manufacturing Institute here in Manchester got to continue to expand the operations that they're doing. And when we look at the long term, the number of jobs that will be created from that, the innovation and the ability to manufacture cells and tissues and organs ultimately is really exciting in terms of what it will mean for healthcare. We also passed the Inflation Reduction Act. I saw Roger Stevenson, so I told him I had to mention the IRA because of the funding that's in there to help address climate change and moving to alternative energy sources, chips and science to help us rebuild our semiconductor industry in this country, which we need if we're going to do everything from refrigerators to automobiles to computers. We've got to have semiconductors, and right now most of those are being made in Taiwan, which adds additional significance when we think about the competition with China. And then I have to mention, on a point of personal pride, that our office has helped get congressionally directed spending awards in the order of about $174 million for 181 projects across the state, projects that probably would not have gotten funded any other way. So my appreciation to Sarah Holmes and Tina Kassem and all of my staff who are here who worked on that effort and really have done a great job over the last couple of years. Sarah, did you start that applause? Neil, okay, thank you, Neil. Now, where are we? Clearly, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And, I think people are feeling concerned not just because of some of the costs that people are still dealing with, but also because of the uncertain situation globally, because of the uncertainty that they're still seeing in Washington, the fact that we had 3 weeks of the House of Representatives shut down while they tried to figure out a speaker, I think added to uncertainty. The fact that while I was very hopeful that we were on track to actually get our budget done, at least relatively on time this year, because all of the bills passed out of the Appropriations Committee by the summer, that has been held up, and as you know, we're now operating on a continuing resolution, which adds uncertainty for businesses who are looking at federal grants and support that they need. It adds uncertainty for all of our federal employees, for our military. I can tell you, as I've traveled in Europe, and I was just in Canada a couple of weeks ago for the Halifax Security Forum, people are watching, and they're concerned about what's happening here in the United States. When I was in Europe, every official I met with knew that we didn't have a Speaker of the House. And since Chris and Annie aren't here, I won't talk too much about the House because I'm not an expert on the House. But it adds uncertainty and concern, and that affects not just our own economy, but it affects the global situation. As we're looking at the end of this year, we are hoping to do several things. One is to pass a national security supplemental bill that would address funding for Ukraine, that would address funding for Israel, humanitarian support, not just in Ukraine and Gaza, but also in a number of countries where, because of what's happening globally, they are very food insecure, particularly in Africa. The high cost of energy prices has driven up the cost, and the shutdown of the lanes to get grain out of Ukraine has had a huge impact. One of the people I saw when I was in Halifax was Cindy McCain, who heads the World Food Program, and she is very concerned about our ability to continue to support those people who are in desperate need of food. And the reason that matters to us in the U.S. is because those places, that creates instability, and instability means conflict, and conflict has the potential to engage the United States in ways that are very challenging, as we're seeing in the Middle East and in Ukraine. There's also funding for the submarine industrial base. I think Granite State, yes. I knew you were here, John. Granite State Manufacturing is here, so you're interested in that, as a lot of our companies are in New Hampshire. And funding to address the Indo-Pacific, because, as you know, one of our big challenges is not just what Vladimir Putin is doing in Ukraine and his designs on Eastern Europe and other parts of Europe, but it's also what's happening with China and the competition, and making sure that we can support Taiwan as they're better able to stand up to the Chinese is really important. So I am hopeful that we can get this supplemental bill across the finish line. If it were just those items, I think it would have passed already. It would have passed out of the Senate, and I think would have passed the House. But one of the provisions that's been added has to do with border security, which I agree is a challenge, and we need to better address it. But we haven't been able to come to an agreement in the Senate about how to do that. So that's challenging, and many of my colleagues who I've talked to think unless we can do that, it's going to be hard to get this across the finish line, not just in the Senate, but in the House. So we are working hard. Hopefully that's going to get done, because this bill, I think, is about our national security, and it's also about promoting democracy around the world. I think it's important for us to support the Ukrainians who have been so courageous against Vladimir Putin, because if we allow a dictator like Putin to arbitrarily go into another country, there's no telling where he's going to stop. Now, I can tell you I hear from the leaders in the Baltic states, from Poland, from Eastern Europe, who say, we support NATO, we're all in to support the Ukrainians because we know Putin's not going to stop. And I can tell you it's a much better investment for us to support Ukraine than for us to ultimately have to send our men and women to fight overseas. So this is an investment that is important to do. And I have to tell you, I'm really proud to be able to, in Washington, say to people who ask me about this, that what I hear from people in New Hampshire is that they support this investment. And, you probably know that Alex Ray has been very engaged with a number of other people in Ukraine, in New Hampshire, in helping those in Ukraine get through this war. So thank you all for support for this effort. Let me just say a word also before I close about what's happening in the Middle East with Israel and Gaza. I think we all agree that we've got to defeat terrorist organizations like Hamas, that it's important for us to support countries who are trying to defend themselves. And I think that is very important. I know we're also very concerned about what's happening with Palestinians who have been so affected in Gaza and the challenges. And I was very distressed when I saw the ceasefire end today and fighting resume because of the potential for what that means for the humanitarian situation there. But one of the reasons that we need to be paying attention to what's happening in the Middle East is also because of what Iran is doing. And so far, that hasn't spread to be a broader war. I think the administration has done a good job in sending in several carrier groups into the Mediterranean and the region. But that puts at risk some of our soldiers. But it's important for us to be very clear that we want to do everything we can to oppose a broader war. I also think it's an important message to Iran to know that we are there to try and prevent an expansion of that war. And so far, all of the news I've seen, and this is open source reporting, so I'm not telling you anything you haven't been able to read, is that Iran is not interested in expanding the conflict beyond Gaza and what's happening now. So that's good news. Hopefully that will continue, because Iran, as we know, has been a funder of Hamas and Hezbollah and terrorist groups across the Middle East. It is now supporting Russia and the war in Ukraine and is providing arms for that. And so there is a nexus there of our adversaries that is really challenging as we think about the long term. And it's very important that we are vigilant and doing everything we can, both to prevent a broader war, but also to think about how we can curtail Iran's activities in support of terrorism. So let me stop there on that down note and wish everybody happy holidays. If I don't get a chance to see you personally before we end, I am optimistic about our ability to address the needs that we have in this country, but it's hard work, and that's why the New England Council's efforts and your efforts as individuals, as business owners and CEOs is really important, to keep the pressure on to say we need to address these issues, because in a democracy, that's how things get done. So thank you all.
Some of you were kind enough to give me a couple of questions to ask the Senator, but before I begin, let me just acknowledge the presence of Senator Lou D'Alessandro. District 20, he's been... As you know, he's been a little under the weather, and but he's back, and he said, the Senator is speaking, I'm going to be there for her, and he was probably the second person to be here this morning outside of Larry. So he's a strong supporter of the Senator and a longtime supporter, but it's good to see him. Senator, you mentioned briefly there might be an outside chance of a full-year appropriation bill passing. Is that unrealistic now? And that full year appropriation bill will be the housing and energy and transportation, all these good things, but your thoughts on whether that's unrealistic now?
Well, we're already into the new fiscal year, so it's not going to be a full year. And we have a continuing resolution that's an interesting, I don't know quite how to describe it. It's different than we've ever done. We have a continuing resolution that covers part of the government until January 19th and another part of the government until February 2nd. And I think we supported that in the Senate because we thought that would get something through the House, which was really in doubt. So the question is, can we get the rest of the appropriations bills through the process? The Senate has already passed out 3 of our appropriations bills. The hope is that because the bills have already been through committee in the Senate, they've had a lot of input, there have been hearings, people have had a chance to engage, that we could put all of them together and pass them out of the Senate to the House, and who knows what the House will do at that point. But so I think that's probably the most optimistic. Now, we would probably do it in 2 efforts, one for January 19th and the second for the later date. And the reason why you probably, those of you who follow government know that we've done this a lot, had this big omnibus bill at the end of the year that covers everything in government. What makes this different and better, I think, is that these are actually pieces of legislation that have gone through the committee, that have had a chance for people to have input on, to see what's in them. So one of the big problems with those big bills at the end of the year, when nobody's had a chance to see what's in them, is you don't know what's in them. You know, the Speaker, the Senate President, the majority leader, the the people in charge know what's in it, but the rest of us don't. And so there sometimes, those of you who spend a lot of time in Washington, you know there's sometimes a lot of surprises when you actually go through those bills. So this would avoid that. The other good thing about doing it this way is it would keep those people who are trying to prevent the budget from going through from having more than one bite at the apple. And again, that's important. One of the things that was very frustrating to me is that we had these first 3 appropriations bills put together out of committee, and I should say that Patty Murray, who chairs the Appropriations Committee, and Susan Collins, who's the vice chair, have done a great job. They have worked closely together. They have really, all of those bills have come out of our committee with overwhelming numbers. Like I chair the Commerce, Justice, and Science Subcommittee. Our bill came out of committee 28-1. So a lot of bipartisan support and cooperation. And what was really troubling was we were ready to go to the floor to move this bill through, and Ron Johnson held it up for 2 weeks because he had another issue that wasn't even related. And so that's become very challenging. So there are a couple of good reasons why trying to do this way this year would make a lot of sense, and I'm hopeful that we can move it in that way.
You know, you're an expert on military affairs. You have a senator that put a hold on over 400.
I don't claim him.
One senator since February has held up over 400 promotions for military personnel, not only affecting them and their promotions, affecting their families and whether they should take the promotion, and that means move into a new district and new schools, and it's also a national security issue.
It is.
My question is, why has the United States Senate allowed one man or one senator to hold up over 400? Why couldn't the majority party come together and say, we're going to get a resolution, we're going to put it through the Rules Committee, we'll bring it to the floor, and we'll get over 66, probably beyond 67 votes to stop this from occurring?
A really important point. And that's actually where we are now. For those of you who haven't paid attention, this is a senator from Alabama who is mad about the Secretary of Defense's policy, which would allow women who are in need of reproductive health services to go outside of their where they're stationed if those states don't have access to those services, and to actually be paid, continue to be paid while they're getting that health care. And he has held up all military appointments at a time when recruitment is a real problem in our military. The only branch of the military right now that's meeting its recruitment goals are the Marines. And this contributes to concern among young men and women who are interested in the military about whether this is a career they really want. When one person can hold up their appointments based on nothing that they've done. So it makes me really angry. And I'm for changing that rule. I was for changing that rule that says one person can do what we call blanket holds, hold up a whole bunch of people, a long time ago. And right now where we are is there is something that's come out of the Rules Committee. It's going to go to the floor. The reason we didn't do it sooner is we didn't have the votes. Sadly, we didn't have enough of our Republican colleagues who are willing to vote with us to do something about this. But it's harmful, and it also, again, contributes to uncertainty, contributes to how the rest of the world sees the United States. I can, again, tell you, as I said, I was in Europe, I was in the Western Balkans in October, and they are watching what we're doing here. They know more about what's happening in the United States than many people in the United States know what's happening in our government. And they don't understand how a country like the United States could allow this to happen. And I think I hope that we're going to be able to change this rule, that we're going to be able to get this done. And I think we are at a place now where we can't allow one person in the Senate to hold up not just appointments, but to hold up legislation. That may have worked, for a very long time when people were more respectful and more willing to work together. It doesn't work now, and we need to change it.
Just a political question. Do you think the Senate is becoming less democratic in the sense of 2024, you have 23.
With a small d?
You have 23 of the 23 Democrats that are up for re-election out of 34 seats that are up. 3 of those seats states that Donald Trump carried. Are you worried that this could be not a very good year for the Democrats?
What I'm worried more about, Jim, is that what we're seeing in elections is more people who are at the extreme end of politics. And I had a conversation with one of my Republican colleagues who's not running for re-election, so you can probably figure out who this is. But he said to me, since I've been here, 10 Republicans who are moderates have left the Senate. And if you can't, our country's built on compromise. If you can't work together and figure out how to compromise, you can't get things done. And that affects everybody. And so I'm more worried about that than I am about whether we're electing Democrats or Republicans. What we need to be doing is electing people who are interested in making government work and getting things done for the country. That's what we need.
Just one final question, going back to the immigration. The House seems to be intent on passing a Ukraine bill, Israel bill separately, and there may be conditions. My reading in the Senate is that they'd like to, even Mitch McConnell's in agreement of a package, that there'd be one vote on Ukraine, there'd be one vote including Ukraine and Israel, maybe Taiwan and the southern border, but one vote for that package of security. But the House is saying, no, we're going to do it one by one. How do you think this is going to play out?
The House is going to lose.
Well, with that,
No, look, first of all, they can't even get those bills one by one through the House. So how are they ever going to get them through the Senate? So, no, we need to do all of this together, keep people on board, have a package that says to the rest of the world that we are here to support those people who are fighting for democracy. We're here to support those people who are in need of humanitarian assistance. We're here to stand up to China and to Russia, and that's what this bill is all about.
well, what a message it sends to the world that Congress adjourns for the holiday and not pass any aid to Ukraine, Israel. Imagine the world leaders saying, what is going on in Washington with the leaders there? So,
Well, I think we're going to pass this by the end of the year.
great. Made some news today. Question from Mark, AARP. You want a mic?
Thank you. Senator, I feel compelled to thank the staff, Neil and the staff of the New Hampshire Institute of Politics. When they redecorated this room, your picture with your husband and President Carter made the cut.
Thank you. Actually, you may not know, I also am in that picture with Gary Hart, too.
Anyway, I do it.
You can see me aging.
They're all over the place. But, Senator, I do have a question, too, if I may.
Oh, yeah, and that one.
On behalf of AARP New Hampshire, we want to thank you for all the work you have done for the 50-plus generation in our state. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate that you let us work with you. With that said...
I have a vested interest.
And with that said, the word on the street is that Social Security could be in jeopardy. Our question is, our members, our 50-plus people worked hard their entire life and have paid into Social Security and are now counting on it for their retirement because they earned it. What do you think the Congress and you will do with Social Security to protect it for our children, our grandchildren, and ourselves? Thank you.
Well, thank you, and I agree. I've had people who say to me, I don't know why they call Social Security an entitlement. We paid into it. It's our money. We should get it back, right? And while it's not in immediate jeopardy, we do need to do something about Social Security and for the long term to make sure that it continues to be there in the future. I don't have a magic answer for how to do that, but I do think we need to have people who are begin to work on that. And as you may remember back in the 80s when Social Security was in trouble, I think it was President Reagan who appointed a commission, and they made recommendations and they fixed it very quickly in one session of Congress. So it can be done. It's not out of the realm of possibility, and we need to make sure that it's there for everybody who needs it in the future.
Questions for the senator? While they're thinking of a question, do you have any thoughts on Senator Manchin and Senator Romney forming that commission to study debt?
Well, I co-sponsored the legislation. Some of you may remember the Simpson-Bowles Act back in right after I got to the Senate. I had an interesting exchange with former Senator Gregg this week because we're working on something around the Connecticut Lakes headwaters, and he had seen that I sponsored the legislation, and he said, yeah, we should have passed Simpson-Bowles when we had the chance, because he worked on that. So I think we've got to be willing to, I know there has been concern expressed by some people who are worried, some people who are worried about what that might mean for Social Security and Medicare, and I appreciate that. But we got to deal with the country's debt long term. This is not something that's going to affect us tomorrow, but it is a long-term problem. It's something we should be concerned about for our children and grandchildren. And if we don't talk about it, if we don't look at what the alternatives are, then we're never going to be able to address it. And the alternatives, as we think about what we need to do, we're probably not all going to like what we need to do. But again, that's what government is all about. It's trying to figure out what's the best way forward, how do we compromise to address the challenges that we're facing.
You know, the debt, the interest on the debt is probably equal to what we spend now on defense.
Yeah.
It's just growing.
I mean, it's not sustainable long term.
Joe Donovan.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you to the Council for having this event. Senator, while it's not a conflict, there's a lot of attention on Taiwan and potential movement by China. Obviously, you and your colleagues are looking at this closely. You're following it. Any thoughts or any information you can share with us relative to that situation?
Well, a couple of things. As you know, the President and Xi just had at the APEC summit in California last week, had a face-to-face meeting that I thought went very well from the U.S. perspective. There were two things that I thought were really important that happened there. One was the agreement to address precursor chemicals for fentanyl, which, as we know, is really a scourge. 2/3 of the overdose deaths in the U.S. and in New Hampshire are from fentanyl. So, and they're already beginning to take action. So in talking to some experts, I just met with the administrator of the DEA yesterday, Ann Milgram, and I was asking her about it because there will be a working group that talks about how we can coordinate with law enforcement. And she said, yes, we can already see a change in the Chinese attitude about dealing with this. So we don't know how long it'll last, but that's positive. The other thing that's really important that came out of that is the resumption of military-to-military conversations. As you probably saw after the downing of the balloon, the top Chinese military officials refused to talk to Secretary Austin and our military leaders. And that's a prescription for an unexplained disaster, because if you can't talk to each other, which we did throughout the Cold War with the Russians, then there could be a potential crisis that we couldn't resolve. So I thought those were two very positive outcomes from that summit, or that conversation. And, excuse me, the other thing that I heard from some China experts this week is that they have seen, they saw in Xi a dramatic, for China watchers, a dramatic change in his approach to the United States. And they attributed that to the Chinese economy not doing so well, and his need and the real impact that our tariffs on Chinese exports has had on the Chinese economy. And you probably saw that he met with a number of CEOs from private companies while he was here. Now, having said that, so that's the good news. The bad news is that Xi, according to China watchers, has consolidated power almost totally in one man, and that's him. He is, and while this has been a dictatorship, the Communist Party, it's obviously been a communist country, there had been a decision-making process that allowed for input from people, and apparently that has almost entirely left, which I find troubling because I think it means that you're not hearing what's really happening. In fact, the joke was, yes, what Xi hears from his advisors is, "You're doing such a good job, Mr. President. You're doing an exemplary job, Mr. President." So it's not, there are no adverse voices that are getting to him. And, that means that decision-making, I think, is not as good.
Like he said, she said.
Robin.
Senator, could you talk a little bit about where you and your colleagues are on artificial intelligence? What are the things that are of concern to you, and where do you sort of see the Senate taking artificial intelligence issues?
Did everybody hear that? That was a question about AI. We've been having a tutorial about AI. We've been hearing from experts, and I have been able to get to about half of those meetings. And, on the positive side, the opportunities that exist from AI are tremendous. I met with the CEO of a company the CEO lives in New Hampshire, his company is not here, but who was talking about the ability of AI to help us deal with our border crisis. And the opportunities in medical science are huge. Now, the downside, of course, is the potential negative impacts of that. One of the really interesting stories from the China summit, or the APEC summit with Xi, was somebody reported to me that, Xi had all of these bodyguards, and that as he was leaving, his bodyguards were following him out, and he said, "You almost didn't see this, but one of the bodyguards took out the spray and sprayed the whole area where he'd been sitting because he was getting rid of his DNA. Because the Chinese are collecting the DNA, and they're using AI in ways that have potential really negative outcomes in the future. So I hope we will do better, and I hope I don't offend too many of you in the room with saying this. I hope we will do better in looking at how we can regulate AI than we have done with social media and the internet. Because, again, the internet has provided all of these opportunities, but we have done a really lousy job of addressing the negative impacts of that. And hopefully we'll do a better job with AI.
So maybe the last question, I know you're a tight schedule. Mark was kind enough to allude to the picture here on the right, and Neil was kind enough to put the picture up. What Mark didn't say is that he rotates these, so he put you up today. But we love Neil. No, you're always there. You're always there. But can you give a little reflection in light of losing the former First Lady, Rosalind, your experience in meeting her in New Hampshire and what she meant to the president as a key advisor, and also just her extraordinary career?
Yeah, for many of you probably know that Billy and I got involved in politics in New Hampshire working for Jimmy Carter. And so we went to the first campaign meeting that the Carters had when Jimmy started running for president. And the reason we were interested in Carter is because we were in Mississippi. When he got elected governor of Georgia, I was teaching in a newly integrated school in Mississippi. And the fact that he was willing to embrace an end to segregation in the South and talk about integration and hang a portrait of Martin Luther King in the governor's office really meant something, because they were not doing that in Mississippi at the time, I can tell you. But we got a chance to travel with Jimmy and Rosalind in those early days when he was still Jimmy Who. And Rosalind was everything, all of the news reports that talked about her life, she was everything that they said. She was strong, she was gracious, she was empathetic. She knew issues. I can remember even in those days, she talked about the importance of mental health. She was one of the real pioneers in saying mental health is a real issue here, and we need to be dealing with it like we deal with other health care issues. And she was very savvy from a campaign perspective, probably in some ways even more so than Jimmy was, because she could read a room very well. And then I had a chance to travel with Jimmy. Billy and I did, actually. We were in the West Bank in 2006 when Hamas got elected to run Gaza with the Carter Foundation on an election observation mission. And it was amazing to see them operate, because, at that point, they were in their 80s, and he was visiting more polling places than anybody else in the delegation. And that commitment to continuing to make a difference for people, not just in the United States, but around the world, was there throughout Rosalind's whole career. And, of course, we're seeing it with President Carter as well. If you haven't read Jonathan Alter's book about Carter's presidency that talks a lot about both Rosalind and Jimmy, I would really recommend it. It's a wonderful book, and really presents that presidency in a light that I think got lost because of all of the other events. But she's been a wonderful role model, and I can tell you that I will miss her.
What a great way to end it. Well done. Nice way to end it.